Well, we got a notice on Friday that apparently around 7:30, 8 o'clock this evening, we're not supposed to drink the tap water here at the church until tomorrow morning because they're going to flush the system with a heavy shock of chlorine to make sure that our water is staying pure and good to drink. Which is kind of inconvenient, you know, if you're down here this evening to realize that I can't turn the tap on and have a drink of water. But that is very much a first world kind of problem, isn't it? That we might be inconvenienced for a few hours from getting water right out of the tap. 840,000 people die every year due to unclean drinking water. Not because they were inconvenienced as to when they could get water out of the tap, but because the only water they have access to is fouled and polluted. Over the last few years, DCC has become involved with a group called Living Water International. Thanks in large part to the work of Martin Murray and others, we have been part of getting 20 wells put in some very impoverished areas of the world. And that is a wonderful blessing. It is one of the most foundational parts of life to have clean water to drink. It's always been that way. Back in 1887, a man named Jack Wheeler, along with another crew, hand-dug a well that was 32 feet wide and 109 feet deep. Just imagine digging a well like that. And it earned the name the Big Well. The Big Well provided all of the water for the town of Greensburg until 1932. At that point, they put in a more modern water system, but the local folks decided to turn it from a well into a tourist trap. And since then, hundreds of thousands of people from around the United States and around the world have visited Greensburg to see the Big Well. Now, back in 2007, the buildings they had all got flattened by a tornado, and so they built a brand new museum and opened that up in about 2012, and today the Big Well is one of the biggest money makers in Greensburg. Now, if you look at the life of Jesus, we have this story that comes out of John chapter 4 where Jesus meets a woman at a well, a little well. And she's there to draw water. Jesus says, "I'm thirsty." And as they get into conversation, they begin to talk about not just physical water, but spiritual water. What is it that the human soul needs to prosper and to do well? And Jesus says to this woman, if you knew who you were talking to, you'd realize that I'm the source that your soul is looking for, that true, good, and pure water. Unfortunately, Jesus lived in a time and a place when many of those that were supposed to be sources of spiritual life were in fact corrupt. And as we've gone through the Gospel of Mark, we've looked at the life of Jesus, we have seen him repeatedly have confrontations with people that were supposed to be on his side. Pharisees and others like them who were the religious elites of their day that should have been pro-Jesus, but instead we find them opposing him at every turn. Jesus casts out a demon, and they say, "Oh, well, you're doing that by the power of Satan." Jesus forgives a man of his sins, and they say, "Well, what right do you have to do that?" In fact, they labeled whole groups of people as nothing more than sinners and used that as a basis to reject them and push them away. And they were critical of Jesus when they saw that he actually would go to their homes and have dinner with them and befriend people that they saw as less worthy than. They were constantly trying to entrap him and discredit him. Last week, we looked at Jesus coming into Jerusalem for the Passover feast, along with thousands of other pilgrims. But as you recall, when he entered, he made a big entrance. He comes riding in on this colt, and the symbolism was rich. It was the symbolism of a returning king, and the people who were excited because they had heard the things that Jesus had done, they actually began to throw their coats down and throw down palm branches in front of the donkey to let it walk over them, which was a symbol of great respect, as you would a king that were entering the city, which was alarming to the religious authorities as they were looking on. And where we finished up last week was Jesus, after the crowds had dispersed, it says that he went into the temple. the centerpiece of Jewish religious life, the reason that pilgrims were flocking to Jerusalem for this magnificent temple. And it says he looked around, and then he went home for the night because he's going to come back in the morning. We're going to talk about that today. In terms of the spirituality of Israel, the temple in Jerusalem was, you might say, the big well. It's what should have been the artesian well of spiritual life. And yet when Jesus looked at that big well, instead of seeing it as a source of life, he saw it as a cesspool. We're going to cover a lot of ground this morning. If you saw the email earlier this week, you know you've been duly warned, okay? We will be out of here in time for dinner, I guarantee it. But what I want to do is I want to go over a big section this morning because we generally look at things like this in little bits and pieces, and we miss some of the big themes that flow through it. And there are some big themes that Mark, and I think God, wants us to see through the conflict that Jesus enters into in that big well there in the temple. So we are going to talk this morning about figs and about grapes and about big bricks and 2 pennies and the end of the world. Let's talk about figs. Mark 11, verses 12 through 14. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Now, at first blush, this seems a little bit capricious. I mean, it's not even the season for figs. Why is Jesus so mad at this tree? You're missing the point if you get stuck there. I mean, this is the first thought that goes through the disciples' minds. That's why they noted it. But it's because Jesus is here at Passover, and this story is going to lead up to what is about to happen. And the point is, Jesus comes to something that its purpose was to provide nourishment. And it looks good. It looks very figgy. But there's no figs. And Jesus pronounces a curse, judgment, on this thing that looks good, but it's not producing anything. And the only reason it was out of season is because Passover happens to not fall right in the fig season, okay? Now, watch what happens in the next story. They came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you made it a den of robbers." What's the problem? Why such a strong reaction? There wasn't anything wrong with the fact that there were sacrificial animals for sale. That really was necessary. The pilgrims that came for Passover came from all over, and many of them great distances. You couldn't expect them to bring the doves or the lambs that might be brought for their sacrifices at the temple. And there had always been a business, if you will, in Jerusalem selling those animals. It had been located on the Mount of Olives for a long, long time. You could go over there. If you needed to buy an animal, you bought it there, you brought it to the temple. Recently, though, Caiaphas, the high priest, had allowed merchants to move into the court of the Gentiles. Now, in the temple, not everybody could go everywhere. There was an outer court, the court of the Gentiles, and those who were not Jews that wished to worship the God of Israel were allowed to go there to worship, to pray. There was beyond that a women's court where women could go, and beyond that there was a men's court where the Jewish men could go. Well, what you see happening here is the Jewish authorities see an opportunity to kind of adopt the McDonald's mindset, a one-stop drive-through experience, and rather than making people go over their Mount of Olives, they're going to bring the marketplace into the temple and probably make a little profit in the process too. You're a merchant, you want to sell in the temple, it's going to cost you a little fee to do that. But that's where the business is happening. Well, where are you going to put it? Well, Jewish leaders, they're not going to give up the space in the men's court. They're not going to give up space in the Jewish women's court. But they really don't care about Gentiles. They don't even like Gentiles. Let's just put it in their court. So imagine now the Gentile believer, the non-Jewish believer who comes in to worship at the temple. What is his setting for trying to worship? He's basically in the middle of a flea market full of animals trying to commune with God. And Jesus walks in, he sees this, and he says, get this stuff out of here. And he refers back to something from Isaiah that says, my house, God's house, should be a house of prayer for all nations. Not just for Israel, not just for the Jews, for all people, that God wants them to come and worship. And he says, you have turned it into a den of thieves. Well, doing that right then, right there, really stirred things up. It reminds me of my buddy Paul. He and I was probably about 13 years old, 14 years old. We were hanging out one day and we discovered out in the field a big tall thistle that had a huge wasp nest hanging from it. And we got an idea. He had an old pickup, so we got the pickup and made sure we had the windows rolled up tight. And we drove up right next to the wasp nest and we got a baseball bat. And we opened one door, and we were smart enough not to hit the thing on my side of the truck, right? We threw the bat over the top so it hit the nest and then shut the doors real quick. Wow, were those wasps mad? And were we like checking every vent in the truck to make sure that we hadn't left something open they were all going to come in through? In a sense, that's what Jesus just did. He just tossed a bat into the wasp nest. He's gone right to the heart of power of these religious leaders, and he's messed up their whole business plan. And they're not happy. The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this, what he had done, and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. This guy is getting too much influence, and he's messing with our business model. It's time for him to go. Okay, remember our fig tree? And when evening came, they, Jesus and his disciples, went out of the city, and as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think it is coincidence that Jesus creates this object lesson with the fig tree, then goes into the temple, clears it out, says some pretty strong words, then they go back out, and the disciples all see this fig tree sitting there dead? That's no coincidence. Jesus is trying to create an image. Well, they probably didn't even put all the pieces together at the time, but what it's saying is, I have come to a place that should have been rich and fruitful. And what I find, it is devoid of anything good. And this judgment can come. Jesus goes on to give some more teaching about faith and forgiveness. We're going to skip that for now because I want you to see how this story lays the groundwork for the next episode. We talked about figs, now we're going to talk about grapes. The leaders didn't take kindly to Jesus' interference. Here's what it says. They came again to Jerusalem, Jesus and his disciples, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him, and they said to him, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" Who do you think you are, walking in here and driving people out of the temple? And not only do they want him to butt out, I think what they're really hoping is they're going to provoke him to say something that they will deem blasphemous. Jesus has made some pretty strong statements about who he is and what his mission is, and when they say, "By whose authority?" I think they're hoping that he's going to make some statement about how, he has God's authority and they can say blasphemer and arrest him and the crowd will support them in it. Here's how Jesus responds. He says, "I'll ask you one question. Answer me, and I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John the Baptist that is, was it from heaven or from man? Answer me. Was John the Baptist sent and anointed by God to do what he did, or was he just some guy that thought too much of himself out there? So they discussed it with one another, saying, well, if we say from heaven, he'll say, then why did you not believe him? Because the leaders had rejected John the Baptist. But shall we say from man? Because they were afraid of the people. Because the people all held that John really was a prophet. Political spiders caught in their own web. How do we answer this? We've done some opinion polling. We're pretty sure that saying of man is not going to play well with the crowd. They have a bad tendency of stoning people they don't like. This is not the correct answer. And so the answer is, we don't know. We don't know. And Jesus said, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Jesus then proceeds to tell a story about a vineyard and a group of tenants taking care of the vineyard. And like with the figs, I don't think it's a coincidence. Jesus tells the story of the figs, he cleanses the temple, they see the fig tree died. Jesus now has this encounter with the leaders. They say, by whose authority do you do this? He basically says, I'm not going to answer that question. And then he goes on and says, let me tell you a story. The story is found in verses 1 through 9 of chapter 12. It's a parable. And the way the parable goes is, there was this landowner that planted a vineyard. And then he goes on a trip. So he leased the vineyard out to a group of tenants. And apparently part of the lease agreement was that when grape season comes around, I will send a servant back and I get a share of the grapes. That seems fair. So the time comes that it's time for grape picking, and the landlord sends one of his servants back. But instead of sharing with him like they were supposed to, they actually beat the guy up and throw him out. And so the landowner sent another servant. And the same thing happens. They beat him up and they throw him out. And as Jesus tells the story, this happens to a succession of servants. What he's referring back to is the history of Israel and how they had reacted to the prophets. God had repeatedly sent to them messengers who had said, you need to repent. You need to turn around. Things are not right. The vineyard is a mess. And if you read the prophets, you'll find that they had a problem with, on a regular basis, getting beat up, jailed, and sometimes killed. But finally, he has one more to send. He had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, surely they will respect my son. Well, the result is they don't respect the son. In fact, in the story, Jesus says they actually kill the son, and they just throw his body over the wall. You couldn't get a greater sign of contempt and disrespect than to take the landowner's son, not only kill him, but then just toss his body out in the field to let dogs have at it. Jesus asks a question then. He says, what do you think the landowner is going to do? Put yourself in this story. Imagine that you have created a beautiful vineyard. You've let people live there. They've got to enjoy it. They've been in the garden. You're going to let them have good produce. They just need to share some grapes. And not only will they not share it, but in the end, they killed your son and left his body out in the field for the dogs. What do you think he's going to do? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. It says the landowner is going to destroy those wicked tenants. And he's going to give the vineyard to others. Now, what was the question that preceded this story? What happened just before Jesus told this story? The religious leaders came to Jesus and they said, by whose authority do you do these things? Right? Remember this phrase that comes out of Jesus' story? A son whom he loved. Jesus picked those words very carefully. Where have you heard words like that before? How about at Jesus' baptism, way back in Mark chapter 1? You remember that? Jesus hears the Father's voice, you are my beloved Son. Or on the Mount of Transfiguration, the disciples hear God's voice speak to them and says, "This is my beloved Son." Jesus in this story depicts himself as the son of the landowner, the beloved son. Do you see how he is indirectly answering the question? By whose authority do you do this? Well, I'll tell you by whose authority I do this. I'm the son of the one who owns this vineyard. That's by whose authority I do it. The tenants have a duty, but they've forgotten who they're responsible to. They've been warned. They've been sent messengers repeatedly, and finally God has sent his son. And yet they're going to kill him. This is prophetic of what is going to happen. But note that in both this story and the case of the fig tree, the end of the story is a warning, because it ends in judgment. Okay, let's talk about big bricks. Jesus then quotes from Psalm 118, verse 22. "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Last week when Jesus entered into Jerusalem, the people were singing these songs of praise, and they were singing Hosanna, Hosanna to the King, right? And that phrase came out of Psalm 118, one of the psalms that they sang as they came for Passover. Well, now Jesus goes back to that same psalm and he picks up another verse, and it's this verse about a rejected cornerstone. He's just talked about a rejected son, and he branches right from a rejected son to a rejected cornerstone. He's saying, not only am I the son, I should be the cornerstone. Now, what is the cornerstone? Well, the cornerstone sets the whole form and shape of a building. It's what squares everything up. It's the first stone you put down. And Jesus is saying, I should be the cornerstone. By whose authority do I do these things? I am the son, and I should be the cornerstone. But what are these squatters going to do? They're going to reject the son. They're going to kill the son, and they're actually rejecting the cornerstone that they should be building on in the process. Well, that heats things up. While Jesus may not have answered the question directly, these guys kind of get the sense that this story is about them, and they don't appreciate it. In fact, we're told they wanted to arrest him again, but they still feared the people. So they walk away angry, looking for a way to win. And so they come up with a plan. Mark 12, verse 13. They sent to him, to Jesus, some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. They got a plan. They all got together, all the power players. And two groups said, hey, we could work together on this. The Pharisees and the Herodians, which is a very weird mix. The Pharisees were anti-Rome. They were looking for a Jewish Messiah to free them from the oppression of Rome. The Herodians were pro-Rome. They were big-time friends of the reign of the Herods, and they supported Rome. So how do you get the anti-Rome guys and the pro-Rome guys to both work together on something? Well, there's that ancient East Indian proverb that says, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And that's what united them. They might fight any other day, but on this day, they were united in the fact that they wanted to put a stop to this young rabbi that was daring to challenge their system. And so, they come up with a plan. The Pharisees come and pitch this thing, and they open up with this really sickening, syrupy flattery. Don't forget, these are the guys who just held a meeting to formally discuss ways to kill this man. Here's how they approach him. Teacher, we know that you're true. You do not care about anyone's opinion. You're not swayed by appearances, but you truly teach the way of God. Have they just seen the light? Hardly. So here's the question. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? We were just wondering. Now, this tax was really, really hated. Josephus records that there actually was an uprising that the Roman rule had to put down with a very violent suppression because of this poll tax. Now, the Pharisees are asking the question. That makes sense, doesn't it? They hate Rome, so it makes sense they'd ask Jesus, should we really pay that terrible tax? But who's with them, standing right behind them taking notes? Herodians, who are pro-Rome. So what happens if Jesus says, yeah, you're right, that's a terrible tax. I don't think I should pay that. Pharisees are going to give a wink to the Herodians. Herodians say, got it, we'll report this to the authorities. This got to be out of your hair before sundown. Now, on the other hand, Jesus says, well, yeah, I mean, I totally support what Rome's doing. You guys definitely should pay the tax. I mean, well, he's going to lose the crowds. And there goes his protection. Once the masses are gone, he's not safe anymore. They can get him. They figure they've got this guy no matter which way he goes on it. So here's what Jesus says. First off, why are you trying to trap me? Do you really think I don't know what's going on here? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. Whose image is this? Whose inscription? What's stamped on the coin here? Well, Caesar's, they replied. Then Jesus said, well, give back to Caesar what's Caesar's, and to God what is God's. What's your question? I got thinking about something. This is off topic, but it's just a freebie. We just had the big tax reform thing, right? And we got a double deduction, which is awesome. Who doesn't want a bigger deduction? It's interesting. I've heard people saying that they think this may have a really big negative impact on charities and churches and missions and things like that. How come? Well, because with that double deduction, you don't necessarily need charitable contributions to get the tax deduction. I think that is the most awesome news I've heard. I am so excited because what it's going to do, it's going to tell us how many people actually give because they want to give to God, and how many people give because they want to get something back from the government. And you know what? God doesn't want anything that you're going to give to him that was just to get a tax deduction. So I think this is so exciting. We are going to know December 31st of 2018 why you all give. All right, the Pharisees, the Herodians have struck out. Now it's the Sadducees' turn. The Sadducees came to him, people who say there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question. And the question is this. Let's just suppose, Jesus, that there's this woman, she marries this guy, he's got a big family, a lot of brothers, and shortly after the wedding, the husband dies. And it turns out one of his brothers marries her, but he dies too. And the next brother marries her, but he dies too, and so on and so on. And finally, she dies, to the relief of the brother's extended family. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? There's a gotcha question. Remember all these guys, now what, right? What are you going to say now, Jesus? It's kind of like that old argument where people would say, can God create a rock bigger than he can lift? Right? If he can't do it, then he must not be all-powerful because you're supposed to be able to create anything. But if you create something bigger than he can lift, well, then he can't be all-powerful either because there's something he can't do. Which sounds really amazing and insightful until you realize it's just nonsense because God can't do things that can't be done. If it's just a logical impossibility, God is not irrational. God can't make a square circle. Those two things don't exist. And Jesus says likewise, he goes, this question is just nonsense. So it's because in the resurrection, they don't give and take in marriage. She won't be anybody's wife. I think we'll still have wonderful, deep relationships, and we'll know the people that we know. I plan to have my mansion next to Burnett's because I really like her. But he says it's not going to be the same, so your question is just irrelevant. But something good comes out of this. Verse 28. One of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another. Now this is interesting because it tells us that this scribe is actually not part of either of the other groups. He has seen this conversation happen. Something's going on over there, and he walks over to find out what it is, and he hears what's going on. And it says that he sees that Jesus has answered them well. He's impressed. He's not angry. He's not defeated because he wasn't there trying to trap him. He's actually listening to see what's going to happen, and he's impressed. And so he asks him a question. He says, which commandment is the most important of all. Now, this was a question that was debated sometimes among the rabbis. In fact, there's an account where Rabbi Hillel was approached by a Gentile, a non-Jew, who said, I will follow your God if you can do something for me. You've got all these complex laws and rules and things out there. I'm willing to turn to your way if you can do this. Teach me the whole law while I stand on one foot. What he's saying is, I'm not going to sit here for days and days and days while you're trying to explain this. As long as I stand on one foot, you tell me what it's about. So, how do you sum it all up? And here's Jesus' response. Jesus says, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Love God, love your neighbor. What's interesting is that Jesus engages in a very thoughtful reply. The other two groups, he just shut them down. Either refused to answer them or entrapped them in their own deception. But this guy, he actually enters into a dialogue. And what you find is that this guy's impressed. He says, you are right, teacher. You have truly said. And then Jesus responds back. When Jesus saw he answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. This guy is different than the other. He may be in their party, but he's not singing the party line. And he's thinking. And Jesus says, you're thinking the right stuff. He hasn't yet become a follower of Jesus. But the story leaves it open-ended. I think this guy eventually did. Because Jesus says, you're very close. Well, let's move on to 2 pennies. In his teaching, he said, beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Jesus moves from a good scribe with an honest question to talking about what was the prevalent atmosphere among those people, and that was they were in it for what they got out of it. They wanted to be recognized. They wanted to be honored. They wanted to be rewarded. And he says they devour widows' houses. Maybe they were exploiting the estates that had been entrusted to them as guardians. Maybe they simply exploited the generosity of those who were weak and gullible and easily led. But Jesus says, watch out for them. Watch out for those people that would use their place of influence and supposed religious authority just to garner more for themselves and to abuse those who are weak. And then he moves right into making an observation about a widow. Again, put this all together. He meets a scribe who asks an honest question. He says, you are very close. But let me tell you about the rest of these people. They are corrupt. They are in it for themselves, and they would abuse and use widows. Hey, speaking of widows, let me show you something about a widow. Mark 12:41. He sat down opposite the treasury, and he watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. People thronging in the temples, thousands of them. These offering boxes were like giant trumpets, metal horns that people poured their offerings into. And how do you know that they're putting in big offerings? Because they made a big show of it. They poured the coins in. Some accounts say that they would have people go ahead of them, the wealthy would, blowing trumpets as they brought their offerings into the temple. And in the midst of this chaos and this show and this noise, Jesus sees one little lady who quietly walks up and drops in 2 little coins. Not like the scribes who are trying to use and abuse the poor and the weak to feather their own nest. He sees one of those who had been abused, who comes with a true heart of real generosity out of love for God to give. And he says, I tell you what, she just outgave everybody here. Whereas there were powerful, supposed men of God who exploited others, this woman gave all she had out of genuine love for God. This is what Jesus found when he went inside the big well. He found a few bright spots, but by and large, he saw a lot of corruption. So what happens when he takes a look at the outside of the well? Let's talk about big bricks again. Mark 13, 1 and 2. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. And Jesus said to him, Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. The temple Jesus is talking about is Herod's temple. It was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was a 35-acre complex. Josephus, the historian, said that the exterior of the building lacked nothing that could astound either mind or eye. Some of the stones, you talk about big bricks, were 67 feet long, and the stones were a brilliant white. It was described as appearing like a snow-covered mountain as you approach Jerusalem. There was a rabbinic proverb that said, He who has not seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building in his life. I think it's significant that this temple was known as Herod's temple. This was more about Herod than it was about God. Herod built this to gain political favor with the Jews. And the Jews who had control of it wanted to keep that political favor because it made them rich. And what was Jesus' verdict? He said, it's all going to fall down. There won't be one stone left on another. It takes us all the way back to the judgment on the fig tree, doesn't it? I come to something that should be big and leafy and good, and there's nothing there. This tree is going to die. I come to the vineyard to receive what should be due to the son, and instead they're going to beat the son up, kill him, and throw him out. And you know what's going to happen? Those tenants will be cast out themselves. Well, to the disciples, talking about the temple being destroyed, that's pretty alarming. I mean, this is like end of the world stuff in their world. Peter, James, and John, they want to know, well, when is this going to happen? That's the most natural question. Someone announces an end of world event, and what's the first thing you want to know? When? Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Jesus' answer gets a bit complicated because he kind of meshes 2 things together. One is, when will this thing, this tearing down the temple, when is that going to happen? But that's all tied to the fact that someday the landowner is going to come back. When is that going to happen? And Jesus puts those 2 things together in one answer. But he begins by telling them when these things are not going to happen. He actually spends more time telling them when it's not going to happen than he does telling them when it will. He says, you're going to hear about wars. That's not it. You're going to hear about earthquakes. That's not it. You're going to face persecution. That's not it. It may seem like the world is ending on any number of fronts, and that's not it. He does give them one sign. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That's a very weird phrase. It means not much to us. It meant a lot to them because they thought back to Daniel's prophecy. And Daniel 9, verse 27, talked about this character, the wing of abomination that comes to make desolate. And what he was talking about was what would happen with Antiochus Epiphanes, who destroyed the initial temple and desecrated it by sacrificing swine in the holy place. Jesus takes that image, that abomination, and he looks forward to another event, a fairly soon coming event. He says, truly, I tell you, this generation not pass away until all these things have happened. Well, a generation in biblical terms was about 40 years. This is about AD 30. 40 years later would be AD 70. Guess what happened in AD 70? The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was put under siege by the Romans. They had gone into rebellion. The Romans come in. They don't take kindly to rebels. They lay siege to the city. A horrible event. Inside the city, there was chaos. There was infighting. There was disease. There was even cannibalism. Whenever the Romans could capture anyone, they crucified them outside the city as a terror tactic. It said they crucified so many people outside the city, they ran out of lumber to hang their bodies on. Eventually, the Romans breached the wall. They slaughtered the inhabitants by the thousands. And then they went into the temple, and to desecrate the temple, they made offerings to Titus as the emperor, and then they destroyed it. But Jesus also seems to look forward to a final judgment, to when the king will return, when the landowner will come back to the right is. And he has this to say. He says, concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. How come Jesus didn't know? Philippians tells us that when he came, he emptied himself. He gave that up. And he says, only my Father knows. Well, here's the point of all of this. Here's the point where he tells them that there will be a day. The point is, stay awake. This is practically a biblical command to drink coffee, is how I interpret this. I have biblical backup for this. Here it is. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It's like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. Do you think he's trying to communicate something here? He contrasts this with the parable of the wicked tenants, remember, who didn't want the master coming back, didn't plan to share anything. He says, no, he says, you've been left in charge of something, stay awake. You see, contemplating the end times is good if you think about it for the right reason. Jesus didn't even bring up the issue of timing. Again, he spent more time talking about what wasn't the sign of the end than he did what was. He says, yes, there are going to be hard times ahead. Don't be surprised. Someday the owner will return. What matters is, are you doing what he left you to do until he comes back? How do we put it all together? What was it that was poisoning the well? When Jesus came to the big well, what was it that was really the poison? I think the poison, in one phrase, would be self-absorption. The leaders had become absorbed in themselves. The fig tree was all about looking good, but it wasn't producing. The temple looked magnificent, but it wasn't producing fruit. The vineyard should have been a good garden that produced something for the king, but the tenants became self-absorbed and they wanted it all for themselves. Those big bricks, they had become a symbol of national pride, a people absorbed with themselves rather than being absorbed with the true glory of God and caring for the Gentiles, the outsiders among them. But it had lost its true purpose. It had lost sight of fulfilling those two great commands, to love God and to love others as myself. And yet all was not lost. While the water was toxic, there were rays of hope. There were still true seekers, a scribe who really wanted to know. There were still true givers, a little widow that would give all that she had. And over it all, the one who was declaring that those big bricks would fall was himself a new cornerstone that wanted to offer a new life, a new source of spiritual vitality. You know, some of us are spiritual cynics. I get cynicism. I easily go there. And we've seen the abuses, we've seen the hypocrisy. And it turns us off. It disgusts us to see the hypocrisy that poses as religion far too often. I want you to know that it left Jesus cold too. He was outraged to see that kind of hypocrisy and greed operating in the name of God. And what he wanted were true seekers. Here's the dangerous cynicism, though. Cynicism can become a trap in itself. Cynicism can really just be laziness disguised as pride. I know what I don't like, I can laugh at it, I can mock it, but I don't really stop and ask the hard questions about what is really true. What does that call for out of my life? Jesus said, "You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart." I would just encourage you, if you are not a believer, and if you're cynical about what you see happen in the name of church, who you really need to get to know is Jesus. He is worth entering into the dialogue with. He is worth finding. And what about the end times? Fascination with prophecy is fine, I suppose, but it can become its own kind of self-absorption. We have our charts, we got our stuff figured out, we're all into when's the end going to be. We become authorities on this or that interpretation of prophecy, and yet we can know all that knowledge and miss the thing that Jesus said, which was stay awake. Are we truly loving God? Are we truly loving our neighbor? The question isn't when will it all end? The question is, what do I do until it does? Staying awake means that I keep reminding myself that I'm not here just for me. I'm here to love God. I'm here to love my neighbor. It means that I guard against becoming complacent when I should be involved. It means that I refuse to live staring at my navel when I should be loving my neighbor. It means that I look up from my cell phone to see what is going on around me. What has God called me to do? I prayerfully rouse myself to see the needs of others rather than slipping into the slumber of selfishness. I keep my hands raised and I keep my eyes open. May He find us to be awake, to be alert, to be engaged whenever He comes back. Amen?